January 1943. The southern edge of the Eastern Front. Night presses down on a frozen Soviet airfield where the wind moves unchecked across the steppe, carrying the distant echo of artillery. The ground crews work without speaking. Their breath hangs in the air, visible only for seconds before vanishing into the dark. A single Yakovlev Yak, one fighter waits at the edge of the runway, its metal skin creaking softly as the engine warms. Inside the cockpit, a young pilot tightens her gloves and checks the instruments by dim red light. She is smaller than most who fly from this field. Lighter, quieter. But the mechanics already know her name, even if the enemy does not. Beyond the horizon, German bombers are moving toward the front lines, confident in the cover of darkness and routine. They have flown this route before. Tonight, they believe it will be the same. The radio crackles once, then goes silent. The propeller bites into the cold air, and the aircraft begins to roll forward. Somewhere above the blacked-out countryside, hunters are already searching for her, even if they do not yet know why. If this moment stayed with you, comment below, like it, and subscribe for more true World War II stories. By the time the winter of 1942 settled over the Eastern Front, the air war above the Soviet Union had already consumed tens of thousands of lives. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had shattered the Red Army's aviation arm in its opening weeks. Entire regiments were destroyed on the ground. Aircraft were lost faster than they could be replaced. Pilots with only a handful of training hours were sent into combat against veterans of Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe moved with confidence, its fighter formations dictating when and where combat would occur, while German bombers struck supply lines, cities, and frontline positions with near impunity. Yet the vastness of the Soviet Union worked against the very speed that had defined German success. As the war stretched deeper into Soviet territory, airfields multiplied, distances increased, and attrition became relentless. By late 1941 and early 1942, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting short, decisive campaigns. It was fighting endurance itself. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses, continued to produce aircraft, pilots, and fuel at staggering rates. Factories dismantled in the West were reassembled east of the Urals. Training programs were shortened but expanded. Survival, not finesse, became the guiding principle. Within this environment, Soviet aviation faced a crisis that numbers alone could not solve. The Red Air Force needed pilots immediately. Not next year. Not after full training cycles. Immediately. It was under these conditions that Marina Raskova, one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated aviators, successfully petitioned Joseph Stalin to authorize the creation of female combat aviation units. This decision was not symbolic. It was pragmatic. Women had already proven themselves as long-distance pilots and instructors. The war now demanded that they fight. In late 1941, 3 all-female regiments were formed. 2 bomber units and 1 fighter regiment. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment would fly Yakovlev Yak-1 fighters, defending strategic targets and later entering frontline combat. The Yak-1 was not the fastest aircraft in the sky, nor the most heavily armed, but it was rugged, responsive, and forgiving, qualities that mattered in the hands of inexperienced pilots. Against the German Messerschmitt Bf 109, it was outmatched in climb and dive, but capable in turning combat and deadly at close range. The men who opposed them were not amateurs. By 1942, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm on the Eastern Front was built around experienced aces, many with dozens of confirmed victories. German pilots flew in disciplined formations, relied on strict communication, and exploited altitude advantages with ruthless efficiency. The sky was their domain, and they intended to keep it that way. Soviet losses remained high, and the average life expectancy of a frontline pilot was measured in weeks. Into this environment stepped a young woman barely out of her teens. Lydia Vladimirovna Litvyak had learned to fly before the war, trained as an instructor, and volunteered for combat the moment the opportunity appeared. She was not physically imposing. She did not fit the image of a fighter ace even by Soviet standards. But she possessed 2 traits the air war demanded: instinctive spatial awareness, and an unflinching willingness to close distance. In an era when many pilots fired from range and disengaged, she pressed closer, trusting her aim and her nerve. As the 586th Regiment transitioned from air defense to frontline operations, its pilots were gradually reassigned to mixed-gender units flying combat missions over the most contested sectors of the front. It was here, over the shattered landscapes of southern Russia, that Litvyak first encountered the full weight of German air power. She faced enemy fighters who had survived years of war. She flew aircraft that returned riddled with holes. She watched comrades fail to return from sorties that began in clear morning skies. And yet, something began to shift. German aircraft started falling in sectors where resistance had once collapsed quickly. Reports mentioned a Soviet pilot who fought differently, who broke formation rules, who attacked decisively and vanished into cloud or ground haze. At first, these encounters were dismissed as coincidence. The Eastern Front was vast. Losses were expected. But as winter deepened and sorties accumulated, German pilots began to recognize patterns in the chaos, and one recurring adversary was already drawing attention long before her name became known. The war in the air was tightening, and soon, what began as necessity would evolve into pursuit. By the spring of 1942, the air war over southern Russia had entered a phase defined less by sweeping offensives and more by relentless daily attrition. The front lines shifted back and forth around key objectives, and above them, fighters clashed in small, violent encounters that rarely made headlines but steadily shaped control of the sky. For the Luftwaffe, the priority was maintaining air superiority long enough to support ground operations moving toward the Volga and the Caucasus oil fields. For the Red Air Force, survival itself became a form of resistance. The Yakovlev Yakun, the aircraft flown by Lydia Vladimirovna, embodied this struggle. It was lighter and more maneuverable than earlier Soviet fighters, built with a combination of wood and metal to ease production shortages. Its armament, typically a 20mm SHVK cannon firing through the propeller hub and a pair of machine guns, was lethal at close range but unforgiving of wasted ammunition. Pilots who failed to position carefully often found themselves defenseless after only a few seconds of firing. Against the Bf-109F, with its superior climb rate and experienced pilots, the Yak-1 demanded discipline and nerve rather than speed. German fighter doctrine emphasized altitude, energy, and formation integrity. Attacks were made from above, with strict coordination between wingmen. Soviet pilots, by contrast, often flew in looser formations, a necessity born from rapid training and high losses. This disparity was supposed to favor the Germans decisively. Yet the chaos of the Eastern Front disrupted doctrine on both sides. Weather was unpredictable. Radio communication was unreliable. Visual contact was often lost in cloud layers and ground haze. Under these conditions, individual initiative could outweigh formal tactics. Litvyak's early combat missions followed this pattern. She was not assigned to seek glory or independent engagements. Her task, like that of every Soviet fighter pilot, was to escort bombers, intercept enemy aircraft, and protect ground forces whenever possible. But when combat began, she demonstrated an unusual willingness to break off from the expected flow of battle. She attacked from unexpected angles, used cloud cover aggressively, and closed distance until the outcome depended on marksmanship rather than maneuvering theory. Her first confirmed victories came during this period. German bombers, flying what they believed were routine missions, were intercepted by Soviet fighters that refused to disengage. One after another, enemy aircraft were damaged or destroyed at low altitude, often in full view of both sides' ground forces. Each victory was logged, verified by witnesses, and reported up the chain of command. Individually, they meant little to the broader course of the war. Collectively, they began to alter expectations. German pilots noticed that certain Soviet fighters were not retreating as expected. They stayed in the fight longer. They pressed attacks even when odds were unfavorable. Losses that had once been attributed to flak or mechanical failure increasingly occurred during close-range engagements. Luftwaffe after-action reports from this period reflect growing frustration with what was described as reckless Soviet aggression, a style that, paradoxically, made encounters more dangerous. As Litvyak's tally increased, so did her exposure. She was wounded in combat but returned to flying as soon as possible. Her aircraft was hit repeatedly, yet she continued to sortie. The Red Air Force, desperate for symbols of resilience, quietly took note. She was awarded promotions and decorations, not for propaganda value alone, but because her record justified them. At the same time, German fighter units began to adjust their behavior in sectors where Soviet resistance stiffened unexpectedly. By mid-1942, German pilots were no longer merely engaging anonymous Soviet fighters. They were hunting for those responsible for specific losses. In briefings, enemy aircraft markings were discussed. Individual pilots were warned to remain alert for aggressive Yak fighters that ignored standard disengagement cues. Without knowing her identity, German airmen began to associate certain encounters with a recurring threat. The war over the Southern Front was becoming personal. Each engagement carried memory, reputation, and anticipation. The sky, once dominated by routine, was now contested by individuals whose actions shaped behavior on both sides. For Litvyak, this shift marked the beginning of a new phase, one in which survival depended not only on skill, but on how the enemy perceived her presence before she was even seen. That perception would soon crystallize through multiple angles of experience, each revealing a different dimension of why one pilot began to matter so much to those trying to destroy her. From the human perspective, Lydia Litvak's presence at the front carried a weight that statistics alone could not capture. She was young, even by wartime standards, and visibly out of place among pilots hardened by months of constant combat. There were no concessions made for her gender in the cockpit. The aircraft did not respond differently to her hands. The enemy did not fire differently at her silhouette. Yet the psychological pressure she carried was unique. Every sortie required proving that her place in the air had been earned, not granted. Losses were constant, friendships brief, and survival never guaranteed beyond the next takeoff. In this environment, emotional restraint became a survival mechanism. Litvyak was described by contemporaries as focused rather than flamboyant, quiet rather than defiant. The sky demanded attention, not declarations. Tactically, her approach reflected an understanding of limitations rather than an attempt to overcome them through bravado. The Yak-1 could not outrun a diving Bf-109, nor could it climb away from a determined pursuer. What it could do was turn tightly at lower speeds and remain stable during abrupt maneuvering. Litvyak exploited this reality. She waited until German pilots committed to attacks on bombers or other fighters, then struck when their energy was already spent. Rather than firing from distance, she closed in until the target filled her gun sight. Ammunition was conserved. Shots were deliberate. This style reduced the chance of prolonged dogfights and increased the likelihood of decisive outcomes. These engagements often unfolded at low altitude, where ground features compressed the battle space and reduced the effectiveness of vertical maneuvers. German pilots accustomed to disengaging upward found themselves constrained by terrain and visibility. In these moments, doctrine mattered less than reaction time. A single mistake, a delayed roll, a misjudged turn, could be fatal. Litvak's willingness to stay within this danger zone set her apart from pilots who relied on distance and escape. The cumulative effect of these tactics was subtle but significant. German losses in certain sectors rose incrementally, not dramatically enough to trigger immediate alarms, but consistently enough to draw attention. Escort missions required greater caution. Bombers adjusted formations. Fighters lingered longer, searching for threats that did not behave predictably. Each change carried cost in fuel, time, and focus. Within her own unit, Litvak's reputation grew cautiously. The Soviet system valued collective achievement, and overt individualism was discouraged. Still, results could not be ignored. She was assigned increasingly demanding missions, often flown under marginal conditions and fading light. Dusk interceptions and low-visibility engagements became more common, not because she sought them, but because her commanders trusted her ability to navigate uncertainty. These were the conditions under which reputations crossed enemy lines. German pilots did not know her name, but they began to recognize patterns. a Yak fighter that appeared when the light was failing, that pressed attacks without hesitation, and that disappeared before reinforcements could respond. What began as isolated encounters now formed a narrative on the other side of the front, one shaped not by propaganda, but by experience. And as that narrative solidified, the Luftwaffe's perspective added its own angles to the story, deepening the pursuit already taking shape. From a technological standpoint, the encounters between Lydia Vladimirovna and German fighter pilots were shaped by contrasts that defined the Eastern Front air war. The Bf-109F represented refinement born of continuous combat experience. Its engine delivered superior climb performance, and its airframe excelled in high-speed maneuvers. German pilots were trained to exploit these advantages methodically, engaging on their own terms and disengaging before risk accumulated. The Yak-1, by comparison, was a compromise aircraft, designed for rapid production and adaptability rather than dominance. Its cockpit visibility was better at low altitudes, and its handling remained predictable even when damaged, qualities that mattered when combat descended into chaos rather than textbook engagements. These differences influenced how each side perceived danger. German pilots trusted speed and altitude as shields. When those shields failed, when an enemy fighter refused to break off, or when cloud layers erased vertical escape routes, anxiety crept in. Litvyak's ability to force these conditions repeatedly unsettled opponents who were accustomed to controlling engagement parameters. Technology had not failed them, but it had been neutralized. From the enemy's perspective, this shift prompted a gradual change in behavior. Luftwaffe units operating in contested sectors began to receive informal warnings. Briefings emphasized vigilance against aggressive Soviet fighters that did not follow expected patterns. Escort formations tightened. Lone pursuits were discouraged. While German command did not yet identify a specific pilot, the notion of a recurring threat became embedded in operational awareness. Losses attributed to unexpected Soviet resistance appeared with increasing frequency in reports. This growing caution carried psychological consequences. The Luftwaffe's strength had always rested not just in equipment, but in confidence, the belief that skill and doctrine would prevail. When pilots began to question assumptions, reaction times slowed and decision-making suffered. The presence of an enemy who refused to behave predictably forced constant alertness, even during missions previously considered routine. Morally, the effect was asymmetrical. For Soviet pilots, especially those fighting in defensive roles, each successful interception reinforced the belief that the enemy could be challenged and defeated. Litvyak's victories were not celebrated loudly, but they were noted. Her continued survival, despite wounds and damage, became a quiet source of resilience within her unit. For German pilots, the accumulation of small, sharp defeats eroded certainty. Fear did not manifest as panic, but as respect, and respect, in combat, often precedes obsession. By late 1942, German pilots in certain sectors spoke openly about a particular Soviet fighter that appeared at dangerous moments. It was described not in mythic terms, but in practical ones: aggressive, precise, unwilling to disengage. The absence of a name made the threat more unsettling. The enemy could be anywhere. Any Yak might be the one responsible for the last loss. This was the moment when pursuit ceased to be incidental and became deliberate. Orders emphasized elimination of especially dangerous opponents. Experienced German aces were tasked with sweeping missions designed to draw out and destroy skilled Soviet pilots. The sky narrowed. Encounters became sharper, more deliberate, and less forgiving. For Litvyak, this escalation meant that every sortie now carried an unspoken weight. The enemy was no longer reacting to her presence. They were anticipating it. And anticipation, once formed, leads inevitably toward confrontation. By the summer of 1943, the air war over the Southern Front had reached a level of intensity unmatched in earlier phases of the conflict. The ground battles around Kursk and the wider struggle for control of the Eastern Front pulled vast numbers of aircraft into the sky each day. Sorties followed one another without pause. Pilots flew exhausted, often returning to their machines with barely enough time to refuel before taking off again. In this compressed tempo, individual skill mattered more than ever, and mistakes were punished instantly. Lydia Litvyak entered this period already marked by experience and reputation. She had accumulated confirmed victories against fighters and bombers alike, and her name was now known within Soviet command structures, even if it was spoken quietly. She flew as a senior pilot, tasked with protecting bombers and intercepting German formations that threatened advancing ground units. The missions were no longer defensive in nature alone. The Red Air Force was pushing back, contesting airspace that had once belonged almost exclusively to the Luftwaffe. The Germans responded with concentration rather than dispersion. Veteran pilots were assigned to hunt aggressively in sectors where Soviet resistance proved unusually effective. These were not chance encounters. Fighters climbed deliberately to altitude, waiting for radar reports or visual confirmation of enemy aircraft. When contact was made, disengagement was less frequent. Combat continued until one side broke or fell. During one such engagement, Litvyak intercepted a formation of German fighters escorting bombers towards Soviet positions. The sky was crowded, layered with contrails and punctuated by bursts of flak rising from below. She maneuvered into position as German pilots committed to their attack runs. When she fired, it was at close range, the target momentarily filling her sight. The enemy aircraft spiraled downward, trailing smoke, while the remaining fighters scattered in confusion. The cost of these encounters was not avoided. Litvak's aircraft was hit repeatedly. She returned to base with damage that would have grounded less resilient pilots for days. On one occasion, she was wounded but refused evacuation, insisting on flying again as soon as she could grip the controls. The demands of the moment left little room for recovery. Survival meant persistence. German losses during this period drew attention at higher levels. Reports indicated repeated failures to secure air superiority in zones previously considered manageable. Soviet fighters were not merely intercepting, they were contesting. Among the names circulating informally was that of a Soviet pilot who appeared again and again at decisive moments. The Luftwaffe's response was predictable. Experienced aces were instructed to remain alert for aggressive Yak fighters and to prioritize their destruction. As the weeks passed, engagements grew sharper and more personal. Litvyak found herself facing opponents who did not disengage at the first sign of resistance. These pilots maneuvered with precision and patience, testing her responses, probing for weakness. The sky became a space of mutual recognition, where each movement was watched and countered. By early August, the tension had reached its peak. German fighters were actively sweeping areas where Litvak's unit operated, attempting to draw Soviet pilots into unfavorable engagements. The air was heavy with expectation. Each takeoff carried the possibility that the next encounter would not end as the previous ones had. The decisive moment was approaching, shaped by accumulated risk and relentless pursuit, and it would unfold not in a single dramatic strike, but through the convergence of exhaustion, determination, and the unforgiving physics of aerial combat. On August 1, 1943, the sky over the Donbass region carried the familiar signs of impending combat. Visibility was good, but the air was unstable, broken by cloud layers that alternately concealed and revealed aircraft in sudden flashes. Litvyak took off as part of a fighter patrol assigned to cover ground forces under German air attack. It was a mission like many before it, flown in territory where danger had become routine. Yet the concentration of German aircraft in the area suggested something more deliberate than a standard strike. Contact was made at altitude. German fighters appeared first, followed by bombers moving toward the front lines. The engagement unfolded rapidly. Soviet fighters moved to intercept, breaking formation as targets presented themselves. Litvyak closed in on an enemy aircraft that had separated slightly from its escort. She fired at close range, damaging the aircraft and forcing it out of the formation. Moments later, German fighters converged. This time, disengagement did not occur. The German pilots pressed their attack with coordination and recall. Litvyak maneuvered hard, using cloud cover and tight turns to evade pursuit. Her aircraft took hits. Control response degraded. Despite this, she continued to fight, attempting to reach friendly lines while under sustained pressure. Witnesses from her unit reported seeing her yak trailing smoke as it descended toward lower altitude. Radio contact was intermittent. The last transmission received was incomplete, cut short as the aircraft dropped from view. No parachute was seen. No confirmed crash site was immediately identified. The sky swallowed the outcome as it had so many others during the war. German records from the same day reflect claims of a Soviet fighter shot down in the area. As was common, confirmation was difficult amid the chaos of ongoing operations. For the Soviet side, the absence was immediate and unsettling. Litvyak did not return. Her aircraft was not found. Combat continued, leaving little time for search or certainty. In the days that followed, hope persisted alongside realism. Pilots sometimes landed behind friendly lines after forced descents. Some returned days later. But as time passed, the silence became definitive. Her disappearance was recorded as a combat loss, though details remained unresolved. For the Luftwaffe, the engagement marked the end of a persistent threat in that sector. Soviet resistance continued, but the distinctive pattern of aggressive, close-range interception diminished. The pursuit that had gradually narrowed its focus found its conclusion not in celebration, but in absence. The turning point was complete. What remained was not the clarity of victory or defeat, but the weight of consequence, for those who flew with her, for those who hunted her, and for the war that moved forward without pause. In the immediate aftermath of Lydia Litvyak's disappearance, the war offered no space for prolonged reckoning. Sorties continued. Units were reassigned. New pilots arrived to fill the gaps left by those who failed to return. Yet within her regiment, the absence was felt sharply. Aircraft inventories listed 1 yak, 1 missing. Operational logs marked a pilot lost in action. The sky that had demanded constant attention now carried a silence where a familiar presence had been. Efforts to determine her fate were limited by the realities of the front. The area where she was last seen descending remained contested. Ground units advanced and retreated in rapid cycles, making searches dangerous and often impossible. Without wreckage or eyewitness confirmation, uncertainty persisted. Some believed she had been forced down and captured. Others accepted that she had been killed in the engagement. The lack of definitive evidence left her status unresolved in official records for years. German documentation provided little immediate clarity. Claims were recorded, but confirmation standards varied, and multiple pilots often claimed the same victory. In the chaos of summer 1943, precision gave way to approximation. What was clear, however, was a change in pattern. German fighter units reported fewer unexpected losses in the sectors where Litvyak had previously operated. The aggressive Soviet interceptions that had drawn attention months earlier were less frequent, replaced by more conventional engagements. For the Soviet command, her record remained incomplete. Regulations required confirmation of pilot deaths for posthumous recognition, and without physical evidence, her status remained ambiguous. Decorations she might have received were delayed. Her name appeared in reports, but without the finality that accompanied confirmed sacrifice. The war's momentum pushed forward, indifferent to unresolved stories. Within the broader air war, the loss of 1 pilot did not alter strategy. The Red Air Force continued its expansion, supported by growing industrial output and improving training standards. The Luftwaffe, stretched across multiple fronts, faced increasing attrition and diminishing resources. The balance in the skies slowly shifted, driven by forces far larger than any individual. Yet at the human level, Litvyak's disappearance lingered. Fellow pilots remembered specific moments, a formation held together under fire, a decisive turn that saved another aircraft, a quiet presence in briefing rooms before missions. These memories persisted even as new names replaced old ones on rosters. The war moved on, but questions remained suspended in time, waiting for evidence that would only surface long after the guns fell silent. Years passed before the fragments of Lydia Litvyak's story began to settle into clarity. In the immediate post-war period, the Soviet Union focused on reconstruction and commemoration, prioritizing narratives supported by incontrovertible documentation. Without a confirmed crash site or remains, Litvyak's final mission remained unresolved, and her achievements existed in an uneasy space between record and remembrance. Official recognition was restrained, not because of doubt about her skill or service, but because certainty remained elusive. In the 1960s, renewed efforts were made to investigate unresolved wartime losses. Veterans were interviewed. Archival material was re-examined. Local witnesses in regions where air combat had been heaviest during the summer of 1943 were questioned. Gradually, evidence emerged suggesting that Litvyak's aircraft had come down behind enemy lines and that she had been killed in the crash. Though details remained incomplete, the accumulation of testimony satisfied the standards required for official acknowledgement. In 1990, decades after her disappearance, Lydia Vladimirovna was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The recognition came late, but it affirmed what those who had flown with her already knew. She had been one of the most effective fighter pilots of the conflict, regardless of gender. Her confirmed victories placed her among the top Soviet aces, and her record stood as a testament to skill forged under extreme pressure. From the German perspective, retrospective analysis of Eastern Front air combat acknowledged the growing effectiveness of Soviet fighter pilots as the war progressed. The notion of a single adversary shaping behavior did not feature prominently in official histories, yet individual pilot memoirs and post-war interviews hinted at encounters that left lasting impressions. The fear was not mythic, but practical, the fear of an opponent who consistently appeared where doctrine offered no easy escape. Litvak's story, once fragmented, became representative of a broader transformation. The Red Air Force that had been shattered in 1941 emerged by 1943 as a force capable of contesting the Luftwaffe on increasingly equal terms. Individual pilots played roles disproportionate to their numbers, forcing adaptations and adjustments that rippled outward. Her legacy settled not in dramatic proclamations, but in the quiet recognition that reputation itself could become a weapon. By surviving long enough, fighting effectively enough, and disrupting expectations often enough, one pilot altered the psychological terrain of the air war. And it is in that quiet alteration, invisible on maps, absent from casualty tables, that the true weight of her impact becomes clear. War is often remembered through numbers, divisions destroyed, aircraft produced, territory gained or lost. Yet in the air, especially over the Eastern Front, fear and confidence shaped outcomes as decisively as fuel or firepower. Lydia Litvak's story rests in that narrow space where individual presence alters collective behavior. She did not command fleets or plan campaigns. She flew a single aircraft at a time, into skies that showed no preference for courage or youth. What distinguished her was not spectacle, but persistence, the repeated choice to engage when disengagement was safer, and to close distance when doctrine advised withdrawal. Her legacy is not built on mystery, despite the uncertainty that once surrounded her fate. It is built on verifiable encounters, confirmed victories, and the documented reaction of an enemy forced to adjust. German pilots did not fear her because of legend. They feared the conditions she created, moments when altitude advantage vanished, when routine escort missions became lethal, and when survival depended on facing an opponent who refused predictability. For the Soviet Union, her service illustrated a transformation born of necessity. The inclusion of women in frontline combat was not a gesture. It was an acknowledgement that modern warfare consumed skill wherever it existed. Litvak's achievements did not stand apart from that reality, they emerged directly from it. She succeeded not despite the chaos of the Eastern Front, but within it. In the end, the sky over southern Russia looks no different than it did in 1943. Clouds still gather. Light still fades. Aircraft still vanish into distance. What remains is the understanding that even in wars measured by millions, individual resolve can ripple outward, shaping enemy decisions long after the engine noise has faded. That is how one pilot, flying into uncertain night and contested air, became a presence the enemy learned to anticipate and to hunt, not because of myth, but because of what she consistently did when the moment demanded it.